Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler Unscripted, the podcast about all things watches, available on SoundCloud, Spotify, iTunes, as well as any other podcast player you might enjoy using, and of course as a full video on YouTube, and of course this one is fully illustrated in order to give you an idea of exactly what I'm talking about, given that this is such a, as you will have read from the title, such an important change to such a recognisable watch, the Omega Speedmaster Professional. In today's episode, I'd like to first of all brief you on exactly what's changed in full detail, and a bit more detail actually you could say in some places than previously has been stated by online publications, so I really will be going in depth here. I'd also like to talk about why this is an important release for Omega, because it marks a new way to look at their collection, and also shows that I think they've learnt from their previous aim to at least level themselves with Rolex as a manufacturer, and seem to have realised that they need to go in a different direction in order to be competitive in that luxury market. What's perhaps most interesting about this watch is the fact that it shows Omega's future intent, because all previous Speedmasters of the last 20 or so years have been a product of a late 90s redesign, so they've always been linked in some capacity to that watch. This is the first time that Omega has fully redesigned the Speedmaster Professional in a modern age, and let's be honest, the Speedmaster Professional is the backbone of the Speedmaster collection. It's also the backbone of the entry-level luxury, and it isn't an entry-level watch. It would require a lot of consideration given the expense of buying such a timepiece, but it is an entry-level into the world of a luxury chronograph, and so an awful lot of people are going to be considering it. That's why it might just be the most important release of 2020, even though we're not even a week in. Before I continue, if you're watching this on YouTube, please remember to like, share and subscribe, and also head over to watchchronicler.com where you can find all of our other podcasts, as well as articles, and of course follow us on Instagram to always know about the most important recent releases and new reviews on Watch Chronicler. So what's happened to the new Speedmaster, or rather the Speedmaster Professional as a collection? Well, the last update was in 1996, when the movement was updated and the bracelet was updated. These were changed quite considerably. But there was also a change in 2014, you could say, when the bracelet was given screwed links rather than having push pins, which made it an awful lot easier to size, and the referencing, that's to say the nomenclature defining which model was which, was changed and updated. There was also the addition of superluminova in 1997 instead of tritium. Most importantly though, this new watch is a full technical revival. That's to say that they've taken the movement, the case, the dial, the bracelet, all of the key components of the watch, in fact all the components you could say, and updated them for a new decade. With that being said, saying a new decade is probably incorrect, given the fact that this might be a watch to last for the next 25 years, with only minor updates, and it certainly seems like they've learnt from the last decade of releases to really know what will hit the spot. But there is one thing which I'd like you to bear in mind throughout this podcast, which is that, to me, this seems to be a realisation for Omega that to remain current, the movement has to evolve to be technically appropriate, but it also doesn't need to become a coldly technical watch in order to remain the most legible and usable chronograph in the world, which is what a lot of people see the Speedmaster as. But to understand the core of this new watch, and indeed the core of the new thrust of the Omega Speedmaster collection, you have to look away from the case, the dial, the crystal, the bracelet, all these things you interact with, and look at the movement, the real centre of this watch. So with this new movement, we're saying goodbye to the very well-known and venerable 1861 Omega movement. Now, the 1861 was introduced in 1996 as a replacement for the 861. The new 1861 back then was fitted with a rhodium plating and also had an extra jewel, so that's 18 jewels over the 17 jewels of the 861, which was used previously during some of the moon missions, some of the later ones, I believe. This was also a situation where I imagine legislation was involved, because for the longest period, 17 jewels was the cut-off for additional taxation for watch movements entering the US. So I wonder if that was the reason why the original was a 17 jewel movement rather than having that 18th jewel. And that was the case for a lot of movements even in the 60s. You saw lots of three-hand automatics from Omega, which had different versions for the US and the rest of the world, with fewer jewels in the US versions. Looking further back, the 861 replaced the original 321 with some nylon components which were replaced with metal in the exhibition caseback versions incidentally, and also added a cam instead of the original column wheel, whilst also increasing the beat rate from 18,000 vibrations per hour, which is 5 ticks per second, or movements of the second hand, to 21,600 vibrations per hour, which is the 6 ticks per second, which you'll see on any modern Speedmaster. But with this next generation, we're moving further forward, So the new movement is the 3861, which has now already been seen on some limited edition Speedmasters released in previous years, and it's a delightful movement in terms of appearance. It certainly is a step up in terms of looks over the 1861, which was starting to look a bit long in the tooth by comparison to some more recent chronograph movements, particularly from brands like Breitling with their in-house chronograph movements now offered as manually wound versions. So the 3861 takes all the specs of the 1861 and improves them. So the power reserve goes from 48 hours to 50 hours, which is a pretty negligible change, but there is now the addition of hacking, so when you pull the crown out the seconds will stop, which seems like something they should have introduced a very long time ago, but it's great to see it now. There's also a coaxial escapement, which is crucial to Omega's new way of looking at their collection, and increases the warranty to 5 years now rather than 2 or 3 in previous generations. In addition to the coaxial escapement, which reduces friction within the escapement and so increases accuracy and those service intervals, it's also a master coaxial chronometer, so it's fully anti-magnetic to 15,000 Gauss, which frankly is so far beyond anything you'd encounter during daily life, you might as well say it's completely anti-magnetic. Oddly enough, it still uses a cam for the activation of the chronograph rather than a column wheel, but this is to be expected given that they've introduced the column wheel in their recreation of their 60s and 50s 321 movement in their top-of-the-range Ed White Speedmaster, which is several times the price of this watch. Something which hasn't been talked about very much is the fact that instead of having a normal balance wheel, it now has a free-sprung balance which has little adjustable screwed weights around its perimeter. This means that you're able to adjust the timekeeping much more precisely and also in a much more stable way than with previous Speedmasters, which seems ideal for a watch designed to be used in space. The hairspring is also now silicon for anti-magnetism, and 10 joules have been added to the movement, giving it a rounded 28 joules for this full movement, yet it still remains manually wound. The result altogether is a much more rounded movement, but also an accuracy which can now be pinpointed between 0 and +5 seconds per day, which really seems ideal, and it's difficult to argue with the technical benefit of having that every day, particularly because a fast watch can easily be set in a few seconds each day, whereas a slow watch is a bit more of a nuisance. Now we have to look at the rest of the case, the area of the watch which you'll hold the most, whether you're setting the watch, whether you're winding the watch, or simply whether you have it on the wrist. And it remains 42mm like the previous generation, but they have changed the dimensions, or the proportions rather, in relation to each other. So this watch is designed to feel like a late 60s Speedmaster. So the pushers have changed. They're now no longer the tall protruding pushers seen on the previous generation, and are now shorter and flatter. The crown also protrudes a little bit more from the side of that asymmetrical case, which should result in easier winding from the crown, but also with more protected pushers thanks to being lower. So I think altogether it's a very good choice. Now one detail of this watch which I think needs to be addressed is the text on the caseback. For the sapphire version with the sapphire caseback, it simply reads "First watch worn on the moon," which keeps things nice and simple. But the version with the Hess-like crystal, which is to say the model with the closed caseback, has seen some controversy and discussion. Now, early reports, including those put forward during the months when this watch was purely a rumour, stated that the new caseback would read "Flight qualified by NASA for all human space missions," which differed from the previous wording which read "Flight qualified by NASA for all manned space missions." Now, for a variety of reasons, people had different views on this change of text. Some people preferred it, and some people found it a bizarre change to a very historically used piece of wording. I feel that it's neither here nor there. Frankly, I don't particularly care what the caseback reads. But what is important to note is that even in the most recent articles, this has been repeated. However, if you actually look at the casebacks on the Omega website, they still present the old text, which I think is rather interesting and suggests that perhaps this was an incorrect rumour, but it doesn't look like Omega have changed anything. One thing to note is there is no increase in water resistance. It is still only water resistant to 50 metres, so essentially I wouldn't take it in water. The dial is the really big change here, in terms of what you'll see, because whilst those case proportions are no doubt something you'll feel, the dial will look down at very regularly, and so Omega have brought back the stepped dial, which was lost in the mid-1970s, to give a better framed look to the front of the watch, and I think it's worked wonderfully. There is also a change to the text on the dial, because the pyramid you used to see with the Omega logo, the Omega brand name, Speedmaster, and then Professional, with the text gradually widening, has been changed. So now only the Omega logo and name are narrower, Speedmaster and Professional are the same width, and sit as a sort of a block on the dial. It's a small change, but I think that it's worth noting. A change which I rather like is that the 5 marks between each second have been replaced with simply 3 marks as seen on the first Omega in space, which was released a few years ago and seems to have made this approach much clearer. This seems like a very good choice to me, and one which makes a lot more sense given that 6 ticks per second, the beat rate of this watch, is actually divisible by 3 and not 5, so you can actually read this much more precisely than previously on other versions. Speaking of which, the second hand is now a different shape. On the previous Speedmaster, and something which started in 1968, the hand was triangular, so from tip to end the hand flared outwards along the shaft. Instead, on the new one, you have a narrow hand all the way along its length until a flared counterweight, but still with a luminous tip. And this is much more similar to those used on the Moon, rather than later Speedmasters. And I must say I rather like this change. I think it's more delicate, but I can see why some people would think that it's a little bit too vintage for this watch as a direction. A change which won't appear on all watches is an applied logo, because this was something people were looking forward to and something seen on those original Moon Speedmasters, at least at the earliest Moon missions, and this logo only comes with the sapphire crystal with sapphire caseback. The version with the more simple Hesselite crystal and closed caseback comes with a printed Omega logo on the dial. And finally, the bezel has been changed. It's still an aluminium bezel, but now has a dot over 90 on the increments of that tachymeter bezel, rather than having the dot next to 90, which is again something which was typical of those Moon-era Speedmasters. Finally, we come to the strap and bracelet options. Now, both a nylon-style strap and a steel bracelet are available. I think that it would make more sense to buy the steel bracelet, simply because it'll cost you a lot more to buy the bracelet later on if you choose to change to it, but that's of course a personal choice. The tapering, though, on these pieces is different. The strap tapers from 20mm at the lug down to 16mm at the clasp, whilst the bracelet tapers more aggressively from 20mm to 15mm with a slightly wider clasp. And the clasp is a comprehensive improvement over the previous generation. It has a beautiful 3-dimensional Omega logo and strakes going down its length. It's a really beautiful piece. The bracelet itself is also different. The links are oval from the side, screwed, small and rather beautiful. I'm sure this watch with this bracelet will be more comfortable than previous generations too, because of shorter links. Crucially, this is a big step away from the oyster-style bracelets we've seen lately, and I think much more distinctive and perfect for this watch. Now, whilst editing this podcast, I've actually noticed something different about the bracelet. You see, whilst looking back over the various pictures and editing this piece for the video version of this podcast, I've noticed that on the Hesselite version of this watch, the bracelet is fully brushed all the way across the top of the links, whereas by contrast the version with the sapphire crystal has polished sections within the links. I think this is quite an interesting distinction and does show that change between the more dressy version and the more traditionally technical model. It is of course also available in yellow and white gold, with different dial variations there, with applied markers, but those really aren't the subject of today's podcast. But now, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to have to come to the most problematic side of any update with the Omega collection, as indeed is the case with any brand's updates: the price. The price has gone up quite considerably for these watches, although not ridiculously. However, the difference between the sapphire and Hesselite crystal versions has increased substantially. To give you an idea of this price increase, previous prices on the steel bracelet with the Hesselite crystal were £4,260, moving up to £5,000 with the sapphire crystal. Now, however, the price for the Moonwatch on the steel bracelet with the Hesselite crystal is £5,370, and with the sapphire crystal it rises to £6,120. This means that this watch is now competing almost like for like if you just take the high street price as opposed to the resale price with something like a Rolex Submariner. So it means that for the first time the Speedmaster is a direct competitor, or at least the first time in recent memory where price is concerned. And given that I remember that only a few years ago these watches were available easily in the £3,000 range, a price starting with 6 is a bit of a shocker. Then again, there's no argument that this is a more technically advanced watch than the previous generation, and also marks the best price you will ever get for this generation of Speedmaster, accepting the fact that given that this Speedmaster will go on for perhaps the next 2 decades, this is the best price you will ever see it at in relation to pure numbers. Now, of course, economic fluctuations will impact this, but there is always a price rise, certainly in terms of the figure itself, so that's something worth thinking about with this new generation. But what does all of this mean for the Speedmaster collection and for Omega in general? Well, Omega is a leading brand and one which I think has realised that with its culture of limited editions and with a considerable sense of humour, even if that's not perhaps the corporate side, that's more of the public persona, this brand will never beat Rolex by doing exactly the same thing as them. Instead, they've realised they need to do their own thing, and with the new Speedmaster Professional, we see the stylistic culmination of all their work to reach a pretty perfect blend of classical, historic, and modern features. Perhaps you could argue this new Speedmaster is the ultimate conclusion of the discussion about vintage-style watches over the last decade. It takes from its past to the point where it's not abandoning its heritage, something which Tudor made the mistake of doing in the 90s and more importantly in the 2000s, but is also not going ridiculously far in the direction of recreating the past. It remembers it needs to be a modern watch and function to modern standards. Crucially, it shows that Omega is keen for the new 321 caliber in their top level of Speedmasters to not dictate the direction of the brand, but instead a way of managing the enormous collector interest in those vintage movements. To all intents and purposes, for the average person, this is a better watch than that 321 revival piece. The fact is that that 321 caliber watch, which is £10,000 plus in price, is strictly speaking not as good a watch as this new Speedmaster Professional. Sure, that watch has the addition of a ceramic bezel, but to all intents and purposes that's a small element. It's a handmade watch and won't be as reliable as this industrially made and ultimately much higher tech watch, which is the new Speedmaster Professional. So I think that there's no conclusion to be drawn from this overall, because inevitably for each individual, whether you choose an old version with a lower price and a more traditional movement, or this new version with the longer warranty and all the specifications, you'll be buying the watch you want. But it's certainly interesting to consider where Omega is going with this watch, and I think for a lot of people, this seems like a very good choice from Omega to take the Speedmaster in a new direction, but also one which has been proven by the last decade of playing around with their vintage inspirations through countless and often misguided vintage-inspired pieces, but also a few really brilliant models. But what do you think of this new Speedmaster? If you're watching on YouTube, do let me know in the comment section below, and please remember to like, share and subscribe if you're watching there as well. If you've been listening to this podcast, then thank you very much, and please do follow us on whichever podcast player you enjoy using, because it'll keep these podcasts coming in the future. Thank you very much for listening. This is Armon from watchchronicler.com. Out.